step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. These are his words. Let's begin. The city of Vitebsk, the only significant place we had encountered since Vilna, provided a suitable location for the headquarters. Napoleon took the opportunity to finalize the organization of the Provisional Government of Lithuania, which he had established in Vilna, since it was in our interest to spare Vitebsk, and as we entered the city without a battle, it was not subjected to looting. Vitebsk, the capital of White Russia, situated on the Dwina River and equidistant from St. Petersburg and Moscow, was a bustling and well-populated commercial hub. Its province, long united with Russia, had adopted Russian customs and habits. Thus, we did not find in Vitebsk the enthusiasm that had greeted us in Vilna. The inhabitants received us more as conquerors than as liberators. However, the emperor's political interest lay in pushing Poland's borders as far as possible, and the province of Vitebsk was declared, against its will, an integral part of this kingdom. A governor and an intendant were appointed to administer it, with instructions to treat it as an ally, not a subject. At the same time, a new form of unrest drew Napoleon's attention. Local peasants, inspired by talk of freedom and independence, believed themselves authorized to rise against their lords, indulging in unrestrained lawlessness. The nobility of Vitebsk complained to the emperor, who ordered severe measures to restore order. It was crucial to quell a movement that could degenerate into civil war. Mobile columns were dispatched, a few examples were made to impose authority, and order was soon restored. For us, who were not involved in administration or policing, we spent our respite reflecting on our early successes and anticipating further victories. Never had a campaign started more brilliantly. The entirety of Lithuania had been conquered in a month, almost without fighting. The army, assembled along the Dnieper and Dwina rivers, awaited only the command of its leader to penetrate deeper into Russia. Moreover, the enemy's movements since the crossing of the Niemen suggested they had no definite plan. Initially positioned to defend the Niemen with Vilna as their base, they had quickly abandoned the riverbank, destroyed the supplies at Vilna, allowed their communication lines to be severed, and left all of Lithuania exposed. General Barclay had retreated to the Dwina River, to the entrenched camp at Drissa, awaiting Prince Bagration, who had been unable to join him since the French army crossed the Niemen. Then he abandoned without a fight the fortified camp that had taken so long to construct, lingered a few days before Vitebsk, and suddenly departed to unite with Prince Bagration under the walls of Smolensk. The superiority of the emperor's maneuvers was indisputable. The skill of our generals and the bravery of our troops left no doubt. A battle would likely bring victory. If the enemy avoided battle, Lithuania could be organized, Riga taken, and the following year's campaign would begin with immense advantages. The emperor shared such bright hopes. In a conversation at Vitebsk with Mr. de Narbonne, he estimated that the two Russian armies united before Smolensk numbered 130,000 men. He anticipated having 170,000 with the Guard, cavalry, and the 1st, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 8th Corps. If battle was avoided, he would go no further than Smolensk. If he achieved a decisive victory, he might march directly on Moscow. In any case, he saw even an indecisive battle as a significant step toward peace. However, those with wisdom and experienced officers were not without concern. They observed that the army had been reduced by a third since crossing the Niemen, and almost without combat, due to the impossibility of providing consistent supplies and the difficulty of procuring resources, even through looting, in a country impoverished and ravaged by the Russian army. They noted the alarming mortality among the horses, the dismounting of some cavalry units, the increasing difficulty of moving artillery, and the delays in ambulance convoys and medical supplies. In the hospitals, they found the sick receiving almost no care. They wondered not only what would become of the army if it were defeated, but also how it would endure the losses from further marches and more serious battles. Amid these worries, they were struck by the exemplary order of the Russian army's retreat. Always shielded by their numerous Cossacks, they abandoned not a single cannon, wagon, or sick soldier. Furthermore, they knew that Emperor Alexander was rallying all Russians to defend their homeland, and that every step deeper into the empire would weaken French forces and strengthen the enemy. The emperor spent 15 days in Vitebsk. Every morning at 6 o'clock, he attended the Guards' parade in front of his palace and required everyone's presence. To accommodate this, he even had a few houses demolished to enlarge the parade ground. There, in the presence of the general staff and the assembled guard, he delved into the finest details of army administration. War commissioners and medical officers were summoned to report on the state of supplies, the care of the sick in hospitals, and the preparation of dressings for the wounded. Often they received harsh reprimands. No one cared more than Napoleon about the army's provisions and hospitals. But issuing orders was not enough. They had to be executable. Given the rapid movements, troop concentrations, poor road conditions, and difficulties feeding the horses, how could regular distributions or proper hospital arrangements have been possible? Soldiers, unaware of these constraints, blamed the zeal and sometimes the integrity of the administrators. Dying of hardship along the roads or in ambulances, they lamented, "It's unfortunate. The Emperor does care about us." It was at one of these parades that General Friant was welcomed as commander of the Grenadiers of the Guard, succeeding General d'Orsay, who had died in Spain. Napoleon himself greeted him at the head of the Guard Grenadiers, sword in hand, and embraced him. In the early days of August, the Russians engaged our advance posts in several skirmishes, with mixed results. Once all preparations were made and orders were given to carry provisions for 15 days, the Emperor decided to march on Smolensk via the left bank of the Dnieper. This movement began on the 10th, with all corps of the army taking the main road from Orsha to Smolensk. A pontoon bridge was constructed at Rasasna, allowing the 3rd and 4th Corps, the cavalry, and the Imperial Guard to cross and advance rapidly along the Smolensk route. Meanwhile, the 1st and 8th Corps, already positioned at Dubrovna and Orsha, marched in the same direction, and the 5th Corps, crossing the Dnieper at Mohilo, supported the movement from the right. All these maneuvers were executed with a speed and precision that even the Russians acknowledged. The Emperor departed Vitebsk on the 13th, crossed the Dnieper at Rasasna, and by the 14th, the enemy's vanguard, positioned at Krasnoy, was sharply repulsed by the King of Naples and Marshal Ney. On the 15th, the headquarters were established at Korytnya, and the vanguard approached Smolensk. The Emperor, engrossed in military operations, declined to receive any compliments for his feast day, spending the evening instead interrogating prisoners in detail. Their reports, combined with the rapid movements of the Russian armies, led to the belief that Smolensk had been evacuated. At dawn on the 16th, several officers from the General Staff and many aides sent ahead to secure accommodations found the vanguard engaged with the enemy. News quickly arrived that the supposed evacuation of the city was false. General Barclay, who had been covering Smolensk from the opposite bank of the river, had swiftly shifted his forces to the left bank upon observing the general movement of our army. He ordered Prince Bagration to occupy Dorogobuj, further along the Moscow road, to secure communications with the capital while preparing to defend Smolensk himself. The Emperor mobilized the troops, and as the enemy rear guard fell back step by step, we reached the city walls by evening. Smolensk, famous for its role in past wars between Russia and Poland, had long been contested before Poland ceded it to Russia nearly 50 years earlier. The city had since become fully Russian. Its high walls, adorned with towers, still bore witness to its historical significance. Though far from being constructed under modern fortification systems and lacking the advantages of our military strongholds, its walls, spanning nearly 4,000 fathoms, standing 25 feet high and 10 feet thick, along with wide moats and covered pathways, posed a formidable challenge to any direct assault. The ramparts were armed with a substantial number of cannons, while the suburbs beyond the city walls were fortified, and even the houses were crenellated. On the opposite bank of the Dnieper stood a suburb arranged in an amphitheatre, with the Russian army positioned on the heights, ready to support the divisions defending Smolensk. The Emperor spent the evening surveying the entire city perimeter, positioning his army in a semicircle anchored on both sides by the Dnieper. The Third Corps was placed on the extreme left, followed by the First and Fifth Corps, with the King of Naples cavalry on the far right. The Imperial Guard was held in reserve behind the centre alongside the headquarters. The Fourth Corps remained in the rear, and the Eighth Corps, having made a misstep, failed to arrive. The night passed at the bivouac, and contrary to our expectations, the following morning was calm. It was later learned that the Emperor had anticipated an attack from the Russians under the city walls and preferred to await them. However, by 2 o'clock, seeing no movement, he ordered the attack. The troops of the Third and First Corps seized the suburbs. The Russians, driven from the covered pathways, retreated into the city. Breaching batteries opened fire, but the thickness of the walls rendered the artillery largely ineffective. I personally confirmed this after receiving the Emperor's order to inspect the batteries. Based on the unanimous opinion of the artillery officers, the Emperor abandoned the idea of an assault that evening and ceased fire, postponing the city's capture until the following day. As we returned to our tents, discussions arose about the day's engagement. Veterans of the Egyptian campaign murmured comparisons between the walls of Smolensk and those of Saint-Jean d'Acre. At dawn on the 18th, some soldiers, noticing the walls were unguarded, entered the city and reported it abandoned. We immediately took possession. The Russians had set fire to the city during the night as they withdrew. The bridges were destroyed, and the Russian army had taken position on the right bank. Intense musket fire erupted between the two banks and persisted throughout the day as we worked on constructing new bridges. By evening and into the night, General Barclay continued his retreat along the Moscow road after burning the right bank suburb. Headquarters were established in Smolensk. On the 19th, the Third Corps, followed by the First, crossed the Dnieper and pursued the enemy. Marshal Ney caught up with them near Valutina Gora, 2 leagues from Smolensk, and decisively defeated them after fierce resistance. The Eighth Corps had been ordered to cross the Dnieper above Smolensk to attack the enemy from the rear. However, it remained behind, and its absence prevented the full success of the day. I am unaware of what delayed its movement or caused its change in direction. Regardless, the Emperor held a grudge against the Duke of Abrantes and refused to receive him when he first appeared before him. The Third Corps displayed such extraordinary valour during the day that the Russians believed they were facing the Imperial Guard. The Emperor, who had not been present at the battle, visited the battlefield the following day. Amid the fallen, he reviewed the troops who had fought. After expressing his satisfaction and lamenting the loss of General Gudin, who was killed leading his division, he granted the regiments numerous honours and promotions. The newly formed 127th Regiment received an eagle. The vanguard resumed the pursuit of the enemy, while the Emperor returned to Smolensk to devise new plans. Our losses in the battles of Smolensk and Valutina amounted to more than 8,000 men. The enemy's losses were undoubtedly greater, but this was still not one of those decisive victories that could bring about peace. We did not capture a single prisoner. The Russian army continued to retreat in perfect order, always falling back to a new position further behind. Many among us believed that the Emperor would halt and once again establish his army between the Dnieper and the Dwina, especially given the advantage that the capture of Smolensk provided by securing both banks of the Dnieper. The 10th Corps could still capture Riga before the end of the campaign, and by spending the winter in this position, the army could recover its losses. Meanwhile, the Lithuanian administration would have the opportunity to complete its organization, eventually providing troops whose loyalty we could rely upon. This plan might have been the most prudent course of action. However, the Emperor, accustomed to bending events to his will, could not accept such a strategy. He wanted a decisive battle and believed that by relentlessly driving the Russians along the road to Moscow, he would eventually force them to give battle, a battle that, when won, would bring peace. Yet by advancing further, the army had to resign itself to significant sacrifices. The troops could expect to find burned villages, scattered inhabitants, and crops, livestock, and fodder either destroyed or taken. The manner in which the Russians had treated Smolensk proved that they would spare no effort to harm us and disrupt our operations. The King of Naples, always at the vanguard, repeatedly warned that the troops were exhausted, the horses were surviving only on straw from rooftops, and that they could not endure much longer. He cautioned that advancing further would risk losing everything. His advice, however, did not prevail, and the order was given to continue the march. The headquarters rested for a few days in Smolensk, though rest is hardly the word to describe the experience in such a city. When we entered, fires were raging in multiple areas, Russian wounded were perishing in the flames, and residents were fleeing their homes. Eventually the fires were extinguished, and the surviving houses were looted. Amid this chaos, the inhabitants had vanished, but upon entering the cathedral, we found them huddled together, covered in rags and starving. The emperor expressed great displeasure at these excesses. One evening, he ordered the drumbeat for assembly, bringing the entire guard, then serving as the garrison, together. He assigned each regiment a specific district and issued strict orders to put an end to the pillaging. Before leaving Smolensk, the emperor addressed the administration of his new conquests. He appointed a governor and an intendant for the province, organized a second major supply depot, established provisions, and set up a hospital. The army advanced in 3 columns. The King of Naples commanded the vanguard, while the 1st, 3rd, and 8th Corps, along with the Imperial Guard and headquarters, followed along the main road. The 5th Corps formed the right column, and the 4th Corps the left, both travelling 1 or 2 leagues from the road. The route from Smolensk to Moscow traverses vast plains interspersed with occasional hills. There are also forests near Dorogobuj and Vyazma. The region is densely populated, with fields carefully cultivated. The villages are constructed of wood, as in the rest of Russia, but the towns are distinguished by their stone houses and numerous church spires. Occasionally, one encounters magnificent estates, especially when nearing Moscow. It is easy to notice, even without consulting a map, that one has left Poland. Jews are absent, and Russian peasants, though equally far from freedom and civilization as their Polish counterparts, bear no resemblance to them. The Russians are tall and robust, while the Poles are frail and miserable. The Polish peasants are downtrodden, whereas the Russians are merely savage. In an ordinary war, this region might have offered some resources. However, at that time the Russian army, adhering to its scorched earth strategy, burned homes and destroyed everything in its path. Our army, in turn, completed the destruction of whatever the Russians left behind. It was impossible to engage the enemy infantry. The vanguard faced only their light cavalry, which fought merely to buy time for the main army to retreat in an orderly manner. The energy and bravery of the King of Naples were beyond praise. He never left the extreme vanguard, personally directing the skirmishers and exposing himself to enemy fire. His white-plumed hat often became a target for Russian marksmen. The emperor, convinced each day that the Russians would finally halt to give battle, allowed himself to be drawn along the road to Moscow. He pressed on without considering the fatigue of the troops or the fact that he had already lost communication with the other army corps. On the 25th, the headquarters were at Dorogobuj, on the 26th and 27th at Slavkovo, on the 28th near Semlivo, on the 29th a league from Vyazma, on the 30th in Vyazma itself, on the 31st at Velitsovo, and on September 1st at Gzhatsk, 38 leagues from Moscow. We paid particular regret to the small town of Vyazma, whose houses were consumed by flames. While passing through, the emperor encountered soldiers looting a burning warehouse filled with brandy. This sight infuriated him. He rushed among them, hurling insults and striking them with his riding crop. The frustration of being unable to engage the Russian army and the devastation left in its wake thwarted his plans and often resulted in those around him bearing the brunt of his irritation. Finally, at Gzhatsk, he received the news that the enemy was halting to give battle. Never had news been more warmly welcomed. General Kutuzov had recently succeeded General Barclay in command of the Russian army. Emperor Alexander placed all his hopes in this new leader, and the army and the nation shared his confidence. To justify this trust, Kutuzov resolved to fight a general battle. Moreover, the proximity of Moscow made such a decision necessary. Emperor Alexander had visited the city in July, igniting tremendous enthusiasm. The nobility and merchant guilds had unanimously voted for massive levies of men and money, and the people were given absolute assurances that the enemy would never enter Moscow. Thus, the Russian general was duty-bound to attempt the fortunes of battle before surrendering the city. Kutuzov selected the position of Borodino behind the Kolocha stream, 5 leagues ahead of Mozhaisk and 25 leagues from Moscow. Upon hearing of this, the emperor informed his generals and spent 3 days in Gzhatsk preparing his dispositions. The army resumed its march on September 4th, repelling the enemy's vanguard. By the morning of the 5th, we were face to face with the enemy. General Kutuzov had assembled 100,000 infantry and 30,000 cavalry in his battle lines, comprising the 2 Russian armies bolstered by reinforcements and the Moscow militia. The Kolocha stream covered his right flank, anchored on the Moskva River and defended by numerous batteries. The centre was positioned behind a ravine and protected by 3 strong redoubts. The left flank, positioned in front of the forest intersected by the old Moscow road, was also fortified with a redoubt. Another redoubt, built 1,200 toises in front of the centre, effectively served as an advanced guard for the position. The emperor ordered its capture. On the morning of the 5th, General Compans of the 1st Corps seized it, holding it after it was taken and retaken 3 times. Our army then advanced and camped opposite the enemy's position. The emperor set up his tent on a hill near the road behind the village of Valuyevo. The Imperial Guard encamped in a square formation around him. The day of the 6th was spent reconnoitring the enemy's position and arranging our troops for battle. The emperor resolved to attack the Russian centre and left by capturing the redoubts constructed on these points. Accordingly, he positioned the 5th Corps on the right, along the old road, the 1st and 3rd Corps at the centre facing the large redoubts, the cavalry behind them near the redoubt captured the previous day, the Imperial Guard in reserve, and the 4th Corps on the extreme left, near the village of Borodino. The total present forces did not exceed 120,000 men. It is said that someone proposed to the emperor to manoeuvre to the right to outflank the enemy's left and force them to abandon their position. However, he wanted the battle, believing it to be long overdue and fearing it might slip away. We spent the entire day at headquarters, and the impression it left remains etched in my memory. There was something sombre and awe-inspiring about the sight of these 2 armies preparing for slaughter. All regiments were ordered to wear full dress uniforms, as if for a grand celebration. The Imperial Guard, in particular, looked more ready for a parade than for combat. The calm demeanour of these veteran soldiers was striking. Neither anxiety nor enthusiasm showed on their faces. For them, another battle was merely another victory, and simply looking at them was enough to inspire confidence. In the evening, Monsieur de Beausset, prefect of the palace, arrived from Paris and presented the emperor with a large portrait of his son. This event was seen as an auspicious omen. Colonel Fabvier arrived shortly afterward, bringing detailed reports from Spain following the loss of the Battle of Salamanca. Despite his grave concerns, Napoleon spent the evening conversing with him. On the 7th, at 2 in the morning, both armies were ready. Everyone awaited the outcome of this terrible day with apprehension. For both sides, it was a matter of victory or death. For us, defeat meant irreparable ruin. For the Russians, it meant surrendering Moscow and destroying the Grand Army, the sole hope of their nation. Thus, both sides spared no effort to inspire their soldiers. Each general addressed his troops in language suited to their beliefs and habits. In the Russian army, priests bearing sacred icons moved through the ranks, blessing and exhorting the soldiers, who knelt to receive their prayers. General Kutuzov appealed to the troops' deep religious convictions. "It is with this faith," he proclaimed, "that I myself will fight and triumph. It is with this faith that I shall conquer or die, and my dying eyes shall witness victory. Soldiers, think of your wives and children who cry out for your protection. Think of your emperor who watches you. Before tomorrow's sun sets, you will have inscribed your faith and loyalty upon the fields of your homeland with the blood of the aggressor and his legions." In the French army, the marshals gathered near the emperor at the large redoubt to receive his final orders. At the first rays of sunlight, he declared, "Here is the son of Austerlitz." Cheers erupted from every regiment, and colonels read aloud the following proclamation: "Soldiers, here is the battle you have long desired. From now on, victory depends on you. It is essential to us. It will bring abundance, warm winter quarters, and a swift return to our homeland. Fight as you did at Austerlitz, Friedland, Vitebsk, and Smolensk. Let the most distant posterity speak of your conduct on this day. Let them say of you, 'He fought in that great battle under the walls of Moscow.'" The soldiers responded with cheers. A cannon fired, and the battle began. At the same signal, the Imperial Guard and the staff officers left the camp. We gathered near the redoubt captured the previous day, where the Emperor had positioned himself. The attack became general along the entire line, and for the first time, the Emperor did not personally take part. He remained constantly about a quarter of a league from the battlefield, receiving reports from all the generals and issuing orders as well as possible from a distance. Never had there been such ferocity as on that day. There was scarcely any manoeuvring. Instead, the attacks were made head-on with immense fury. The 1st and 3rd Corps captured the two left redoubts twice. The large redoubt on the right was taken by a regiment of cuirassiers, retaken by the enemy, and seized again by the 1st Division of the 1st Corps, which had been detached to assist the Viceroy. The 4th Corps captured the village of Borodino and withstood an attempted flanking manoeuvre by the Russian army's right wing. At that moment, I was sent to the Viceroy, whom I found at the centre of his troops, and I witnessed the valour with which he repelled the attack. Every officer returning from the battlefield brought news of heroic deeds. Across the entire line we were already victorious. The Russians, pushed back from all their positions and unable to reclaim them, were crushed for hours under the fire of our artillery. By 2 o'clock they were fighting only to secure their retreat. It is said that Marshal Ney then asked the Emperor to advance the young guard to complete the victory. The Emperor refused, saying later that he did not want to leave anything to chance. General Kutuzov withdrew in the evening. Exhausted, our troops could barely pursue him. The Army Corps bivouacked on the battlefield. The losses on both sides were staggering, approximately 28,000 French and 50,000 Russians. Among the enemy casualties were Prince Eugène of Württemberg and Prince Bagration. On our side we lost General Montbrun, who commanded a cavalry corps, and General Caulaincourt, brother of the Duke of Vicenza and the Emperor's aide-de-camp. The latter was deeply mourned at headquarters, where he was much loved. He had been assigned to replace General Montbrun and was killed in the large redoubt. Many officers of all ranks were left on the battlefield. The next morning, the 5th Corps manoeuvred to the right to approach Moscow via the old road. General Kutuzov, fearing he would be cut off, decided on a full retreat. The Emperor toured the battlefield with us. It was horrific, literally covered with corpses. All types of wounds and suffering could be seen, with Russian dead and injured far outnumbering our own. The Emperor visited the wounded, offered them drinks, and instructed that they be cared for. That same day, the army resumed its advance, still in 3 columns toward Moscow. The capture of the capital was expected to finalize the victory, and it was there that the Emperor hoped to sign the peace. The Russian rearguard briefly defended Mozhaisk to buy time to set it ablaze. Headquarters was established there on the 10th. It was then that the Prince of Neufchâtel proposed I request the Emperor to appoint me Colonel of the 4th Line Regiment, replacing Colonel Massey, who had been killed in battle. I received this suggestion with gratitude, and having been appointed the following day, I left Mozhaisk to join my new regiment. I conclude the first part of my account here. In the second part, I will write only the history of the 4th Regiment and that of the 3rd Corps, to which the regiment belonged. However, I will briefly mention the operations of the rest of the army, so the larger context of this grand campaign is not lost, and the role of the 3rd Corps can be fully understood. That concludes the 11th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.